At 6:43 a.m., March 1st, 1943. 19-year-old Janet Patricia Oakl stood in the freezing basement of Derby House. Chalk in hand, eyes locked on the linoleum floor stretched before her like a miniature Atlantic Ocean. Red, black, and white wooden. Markers represented merchant ships, escorts, and the deadly German U-boats she knew all too well. Every line, every placement, every movement, calculated. In 47 minutes, she would show that the Royal Navy's doctrine, followed to the letter for decades, was not just failing yet, was killing sailors just 2 days earlier. Her brother Thomas, a 23-year-old destroyer officer, had been lost at sea, swallowed by the North Atlantic because the convoy he protected followed the same orders she had repeatedly proven were fatal. Convoy SC-121 had departed Halifax on February 15th with 59 merchant ships and 9 escorts. Perfectly positioned according to doctrine, the U-boats found them on February 24th by dawn. 13 merchant ships had sunk, 6 escorts were damaged, and Thomas was gone forever. And now, standing in the pit, Janet was about to demonstrate exactly why. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel despair. She felt focus. Mathematics, pattern recognition, and ruthless logic guided every decision she made. She placed her lead U-boat on the floor, deliberately exposing it to the escorts. She calculated the timing, predicted their responses, and watched the gaps appear, the gaps that would have allowed wolf packs to penetrate real convoys and sink them. This wasn't a game. Every simulation she ran, every chalk mark she made, every escort she sank in miniature represented human lives at risk. And she was right. For the past 8 months, she had proven it again and again. And yet, the Admiralty ignored her reports. The doctrines of centuries had blinded the officers. Only now, in this cold basement, would the truth be undeniable. Before we go further, I have a quick question for you. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button to follow these incredible forgotten stories from World War II. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to hear from all corners of the world as we uncover history's hidden heroes. What Janet was about to do with chalk, timing, and relentless mathematics would change the Battle of the Atlantic forever. The fate of thousands of sailors rested in her hands, and in 47 minutes, the world would see how a teenage girl outsmarted the Royal Navy's oldest doctrines. Janet Patricia Oakl was not your typical 19-year-old. A mathematics prodigy, she had a gift for spotting patterns that others couldn't see. Her teachers had always noticed problems that baffled the rest of the class made perfect sense to her. When the war began, she wanted to help. In July 1942, straight from school, she applied to the Women's Royal Naval Service. They didn't ask about experience at sea. They asked about her education, her ability to work under pressure, and her extraordinary mathematical skills. 3 weeks later, she received orders to report to Derby House, home of the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, WWII secretive unit that didn't officially exist on any map. Her mission was unlike anything the Royal Navy had attempted. Officers with decades of naval experience repeatedly failed to protect convoys from German U-boats, following doctrine that demanded aggressive pursuit. Every chase left gaps in convoy defenses. Every gap invited disaster. WWII solution? Use simulations, floor maps, and mathematics to discover tactics that actually worked. Janet's role was crucial. She would command the German submarines, the U-boats, called U-bets in the simulation, and attack the convoys commanded by Royal Navy officers. Every move she made would test the rules that had guided British naval strategy for over 200 years. The Derby House basement was cold. Inadequate heating barely holding back the chill from the concrete walls. The floor had been painted to represent the North Atlantic. Chalk grids marking navigation points, wooden models standing in for real ships. Red pieces marked torpedoed merchant ships, black for submarines, white for escorts. For Janet, this was both a battlefield and a laboratory. 8 months of simulations had already shown the same pattern repeatedly. Officers chased the U-boats, convoys were left exposed, ships sank, sailors died. Yet the Admiralty remained unconvinced. For Janet, this was personal. Her brother Thomas had written her 3 weeks earlier, warning her that the tactics weren't working. Now, standing in the pit, she was about to prove it to show that the loss of convoys, the deaths of sailors, and the sinking of ships were not accidents, but consequences of doctrine that had ignored mathematics, logic, and human life. From the moment Janet stepped into the Derby House pit, she approached the simulations with relentless precision. Every chalk mark, every placement of a wooden model, every calculation on her stopwatch was deliberate. She studied the officers' behaviors, memorized their tendencies, and knew instinctively how doctrine would force them to respond. She had no experience at sea, no traditional naval training, but 8 months of wargaming had given her a far greater advantage than any years of service could. The first simulation began in July 1942. Commander Harrison, a veteran with 32 years at sea, was tasked with defending a convoy of 40 merchant ships with 6 escorts. Janet commanded 4 U-boats. She studied the formation, analyzed patrol patterns, and then deliberately exposed her lead submarine to the escorts. Harrison responded exactly as doctrine demanded. 2 escorts broke formation, chasing the threat, while the others tried to cover the convoy. Janet's other U-boats penetrated the gaps, sinking merchant ships in the simulation with methodical efficiency. By the time the escorts returned, 6 ships were destroyed, 4 more damaged. Harrison's face went pale. He could not comprehend how a teenage girl was outsmarting his decades of experience. Simulation after simulation, the pattern repeated. Every officer followed aggressive pursuit tactics. Every convoy was left vulnerable. Every U-boat attack succeeded. Janet's mathematical models matched reality. The more the escorts chased, the more gaps opened. The more ships were destroyed. She meticulously documented each result, recording timings, distances, and outcomes. She was not playing games, she was proving mathematically that the Royal Navy's foundational doctrine was failing. Resistance came in waves. Many officers refused to accept the results. These aren't real conditions, they argued. U-boats wouldn't act this way in open sea. Janet countered with cold logic, presenting months of data from simulations, comparisons to real convoy losses, and historical patterns of U-boat attacks. Yet Admiral T and the higher command dismissed her findings. Experimental, he said. Real combat experience matters more than floor games. Every failure, every death at sea was ignored. The emotional toll was immense. Janet ran simulations just days after receiving the telegram that HMS Hesperus, with her brother Thomas aboard, had sunk. Red pieces littered the floor, markers of lives already lost, yet she did not break. She continued, determined to show Lieutenant Morrison and other officers exactly how their tactics had failed, exactly why convoys were being slaughtered, exactly how every chase left holes for U-boats to exploit. She methodically replayed SC 1-1, her brother's doomed convoy, 8 times in 8 months. Every time, the result was the same. Convoys were destroyed, sailors drowned, doctrine prevailed. Janet's brilliance was undeniable. Her ability to see patterns where seasoned officers could not made her simulations terrifyingly accurate. Her chalk lines predicted disaster before it struck. Her U-boats, controlled with unerring timing, penetrated defenses, exploited gaps, and sank ships with mechanical precision. Officers argued, protested, and grew frustrated. Yet each simulation confirmed what she had been saying for months. Aggressive pursuit killed convoys. Defense, not offense, would save them. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, the Admiralty resisted. Tradition, pride, and years of doctrine created a wall Janet could not yet breach. Convoys continued to sail with the same fatal patterns. Merchant ships went down, sailors died. The urgency of the Atlantic battle weighed on her every calculation, driving her to refine strategies, test new variables, and exploit every weakness in the flawed system. Each simulation brought her closer to proving once, and for all that mathematics, logic, and cold analysis could save lives where experience and tradition had failed. The stage was set. The tension was unbearable. Convoys were dying, officers doubted, and Janet's small, icy basement held the only hope for change in the Atlantic. Every move she made, every chalk stroke, Every calculation was a step toward confronting the Royal Navy itself. The battle between doctrine and logic, tradition and mathematics, was about to reach a breaking point. February 24, 1943. Convoy. C-1221 was en route from Halifax to Britain. 59 merchant ships and 9 escort destroyers sailed in formation. Textbook perfect, every officer following doctrine to the letter. The U-boats were waiting, shadowing the convoy under the cover of darkness, ready to strike with the lethal precision of the German Wolfpack. By dawn, 13 merchant ships had been sunk, 6 escorts damaged, and among the dead was Thomas Oakl Janet's brother. Tom's Hesperus had been torn apart in 4 minutes. 117 sailors gone. 2 days later, Janet stood in the Derby House basement, chalk in hand, preparing to replay the exact scenario. Every marker on the floor represented a real life lost. Every move she made mirrored the choices of Morrison, Harrison, and the other officers who had failed. As she positioned her lead U-boat, deliberately exposing it to the escorts, she calculated precisely when they would break formation. Predicting the fatal gaps their pursuit would create. Lieutenant Morrison, young and defiant, commanded the convoy in this simulation. Janet watched every reaction, every maneuver, every time an escort left the protective screen. She didn't feel anger or grief. She felt cold mathematical certainty by the time the lead U-boat disappeared beneath the chalk lines of the Atlantic. Gaps had already appeared in the convoy. Red markers began to litter the floor, sinking merchant ships marking the consequences of doctrine-following decisions, Morrison argued. "You don't understand real combat," he said, voice tight. "If we don't hunt the submarines aggressively, they'll destroy everything." Janet calmly countered. "How many convoys have you lost with aggressive pursuit?" Morrison went silent. 4 in 7 months, he admitted. Janet pointed to the 5th, the convoy that took your brother. 2 days ago, Thomas died following these exact tactics. The tension was unbearable. Every officer in the room saw the evidence, yet disbelief lingered. Janet's U-boats struck again, exploiting every gap, sinking merchant ships with ruthless precision. By the time the simulation ended, 12 ships lay destroyed, 4 escorts damaged, and not a single U-boat had been lost. The room was silent. Morrison's face went pale, realization dawning. Doctrine, tradition, centuries of naval practice all leading to the same predictable disaster. Captain Roberts stepped forward, trying to ease the tension, yet he knew the truth. Janet had proven it beyond doubt. The Royal Navy's foundational principle, aggressive pursuit, was fatal against U-boats. Each chase, each decision to leave the convoy exposed, had been mathematically predicted, repeatedly proven, and finally illustrated in real time. Her brother's death was no accident. It was a consequence of adherence to doctrine. 10 That cold basement, surrounded by chalk, models, and silent witnesses. Janet Oakl had achieved what no one else could. She had taken grief, intellect, and courage, and transformed them into irrefutable proof that could not be ignored. For the first time, the officers understood their doctrine was not heroic. It was deadly, and a 19-year-old girl using nothing but chalk, mathematics, and relentless precision had outsmarted them all. The Battle of the Atlantic would never be the same. The silence in the Derby House basement was deafening. Every officer stared at the floor, at the wreckage of miniature convoys, at the chalk lines that had mapped out the deaths of their sailors. Janet's calculations were no longer abstract. They were undeniable. But she had proven that doctrine. Tradition and decades of naval experience had been killing British sailors. The weight of that truth pressed down on everyone in the room. Captain Roberts finally broke the silence. "Admiral Horton needs to see this," he said. "If anyone can understand, it's him. He has to witness these simulations firsthand." Janet nodded, but she didn't smile. She had no satisfaction in being right. Being right hadn't saved Thomas, hadn't saved the 117 sailors of HMS Hesperus, hadn't saved the 13 merchant ships of SC-121. Right now, the mission was simple. Show the man at the top the cold, harsh truth of the Royal Navy's failures. March 3rd, 1943. Admiral Max Horton, one of Britain's most decorated submarine hunters and a veteran of the Great War, entered Derby House. Skeptical but curious, he studied the floor, the chalk grids, the miniature ships. Roberts briefed him, explaining the simulations, the methodology, and the results. Horton's expression remained stoic, his eyes sharp and calculating. When he took command of the escorts for the first simulation, Janet knew exactly what he would do. She had studied every officer's reaction, every tendency, every gap that doctrine would create. The game began. 50 merchant ships, 8 escort destroyers, and Janet's 3 U-boats. Horton positioned his escorts according to standard doctrine-wide defensive perimeter, overlapping search zones, aggressive pursuit. Every officer had done the same thing for centuries. Every officer had failed because of it. Janet moved her lead U-boat into visual range, allowing it to be detected and watched the traps unfold. 2 escorts immediately broke formation. Chasing the U-boat as predicted, gaps appeared. Her other U-boats penetrated, sinking ships with surgical precision. Horton tried to adjust, but every move he made followed the same doctrine that had doomed her brother. Red markers began to accumulate. Merchant ships sank, escorts were outmaneuvered, and U-boats remained unharmed. The simulation ended in 47 minutes, but the lesson was searing and immediate. Horton stared at the board, at the scattered markers, at the evidence of what? Doctrine had wrought. He said nothing. For 30 seconds, silence dominated the room. Then he spoke 5 words that would change the Atlantic. This works. Teach every commander. Janet felt no relief, no victory. Only the cold mathematical truth she had spent 8 months proving. Admiral Horton now understood what thousands of reports had failed to communicate. It's the Royal Navy's losses, the chaos in the Atlantic. It's the lives lost. They were all consequences of ignoring logic in favor of tradition. From this day forward, every escort commander would learn from Wattu's simulations. Every tactic she had developed, every pattern she had observed, every failure she had documented would be implemented to save lives. And yet, it was still personal. Thomas was gone. Hum's Hesperus had sunk. But for the first time, the hundreds. Eventually, thousands of sailors who would have followed the same doomed doctrine would have a chance to survive. Through chalk, mathematics, and unyielding determination, Janet Oakl had forced change, proving that intellect and courage could triumph over tradition even in the face of devastating loss. After Admiral Horton's visit, the tide began to turn. Within days, orders went out to retrain every escort commander in the western approaches. The simulations at Derby House became mandatory lessons. Officers with decades of experience, some stubborn and resistant, were forced to sit in the freezing basement while Janet, Jean, Bobby, June, and Margaret ran them through scenario after scenario. Convoys would be lost again and again in simulations, until officers understood the fatal flaw in aggressive pursuit. The room echoed with the clatter of wooden ships, the scratch of chalk on linoleum, and the frustrated voices of men who were realizing their previous wisdom had been deadly. Janet's innovations: Raspberry, Beta Search, Pineapple, and Step aside were no longer theoretical. Raspberry taught rapid illumination, closing in on U-boats with coordinated star shells within 90 seconds instead of 8 minutes. Beta Search predicted the most likely positions of shadowing submarines, letting escorts preemptively block attacks. Pineapple coordinated zigzag patterns against saturation attacks, making U-boat coordination almost impossible. Step aside neutralized acoustic torpedoes with precise course adjustments. Every tactic was rigorously tested in simulations and then applied in the Atlantic. By May 1943, the results were undeniable. German U-boats suffered catastrophic losses, 41 submarines destroyed in just 31 days. Grand Admiral Dunitz labeled it Black May. The wolf packs that had once terrorized the Atlantic retreated, decimated. Convoy losses dropped by 73% between March and September. Supplies reached Britain reliably. The looming threat of starvation and collapse evaporated. The Battle of the Atlantic had shifted in just 4 months, and it wasn't new technology or Enigma decryption that won it. Was a group of teenage girls with chalk, mathematics, and unwavering determination. Janet continued her work at WWII. Until May 1945, training over 5,000 Allied officers, including Americans, Canadians, Norwegians, and Poles. Every lesson was documented. Every successful tactic was standardized. Convoys that would have been lost under old doctrine sailed safely. Ships that would have sunk reached their destinations. Sailors who would have drowned returned home to their families. Janet's personal grief, the death of her brother Thomas, remained private, but it fueled her relentless drive to save thousands of others. Despite the impact, recognition was minimal. WWII's work remained classified. Janet's name was absent from official records, and public history barely acknowledged the role of the women who had changed naval warfare. The Wren's tactics were absorbed into standard doctrine, and the Navy thrived because of them. Yet the heroes behind the innovations remained invisible. When records were partially declassified decades later, Janet's modesty never wavered. She credited her team, never herself. The true measure of success was clear, however. Between 1943 and 1945, it is estimated that WWII's tactical innovations have saved approximately 4,000 merchant ships and 48,000 Allied sailors. Each ship saved, each life preserved, was a direct result of patterns Janet had calculated, simulations she had run, and officers she had taught to see what doctrine blinded them to. Her work was a quiet revolution, invisible to the world, but monumental in its consequences. Janet Oakl had taken chalk, mathematics, and courage and transformed them into salvation for the convoys of the Atlantic. The British Navy had survived because a teenager refused to let tradition dictate death. Her impact was immediate, measurable, and profound, a testament to intellect over experience, reason over dogma, and the power of one determined individual to change the course of WWII's history. Summer of 1943, the Atlantic was still treacherous, but the tides had shifted. Janet and her team ran the simulations relentlessly, testing new variables and strategies against U-boats that adapted just as quickly as the officers did. The stakes were higher than ever. Every red marker on the floor could represent real lives in the frigid North Atlantic. Each scenario had to be perfect. Any oversight meant disaster on one particularly grueling day. Admiral Horton returned to Derby House to witness the latest war game. Janet commanded the U-boats with cold precision, exploiting every conceivable weakness in the convoy formations. Horton took the escort command, confident in his decades of experience, but wary of the young women who had already bested the finest officers in the Royal Navy. He positioned the destroyers according to old doctrine: aggressive pursuit, wide perimeter coverage, overlapping search zones. Janet knew exactly how they would respond. The simulation began. Janet moved her lead U-boat into detection range, deliberately triggering Horton's reaction. The escorts broke formation immediately, chasing the U-boat just as her calculations had predicted. Gaps appeared like cracks in the Atlantic ice. Janet's other U-boats slipped through these gaps with deadly accuracy, sinking merchant ships one after another. Horton tried to adjust, issuing orders to close the screen, but every reaction followed the old doctrine that dictated aggressive pursuit. Each pursuit created new openings. By the time Horton realized the extent of the damage, 17 ships were destroyed, and not a single U-boat had been harmed. The room was tense. Officers had gathered to observe the demonstration, some skeptical, others apprehensive. The devastation on the floor was undeniable, and the math behind it unassailable. Horton, a man who had hunted submarines for decades, stared at the chalk lines, at the scattered ships, at the inevitability of the destruction. His voice was quiet but firm. The simulations are accurate. The doctrine is failing. Janet didn't celebrate. There was no victory in being right after so many had died. She explained her calculations to Horton and the observing officers. The timing of escort responses, the positioning gaps, the predictable aggressive chases, all could be measured, exploited, and corrected. Horton listened, nodding slowly, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He now fully understood that thousands of lives depended on adopting these defensive strategies immediately. This second climax wasn't just a demonstration of mathematics, it was a confrontation between tradition and reason, pride and survival. Horton had been shown that the rules and doctrine that had guided the Royal Navy for centuries were no longer sufficient. Every aggressive chase, every deviation from a tight convoy screen had a predictable cost. Merchant ships sunk, sailors drowned. Janet had forced the most decorated officers in the Navy to witness the consequences of failing to adapt. The impact was immediate. Horton ordered the new tactics implemented without delay. Officers who had resisted in the past were now compelled to follow the simulations, defensive screens, tight coordination, calculated responses. These became the new standard. The U-boats could no longer penetrate convoy defenses. The Atlantic convoys were finally secure, and the Royal Navy had begun a transformation that would save tens of thousands of lives. Janet, standing in the cold basement, chalk in hand, had forced history to bend. One teenage girl, with mathematics, logic, and relentless persistence, had changed naval warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic had a new champion, not a general or admiral, but a girl whose brilliance and courage had rewritten the rules of engagement. The lessons at Derby House were spreading like wildfire. Officers who had once scoffed at the idea of teenage girls teaching naval warfare were now forced to face the undeniable truth. Aggressive pursuit was fatal, and tight defensive screens were the key to survival. Each simulation was no longer just a lesson. It was a proving ground, a laboratory where the lives of thousands were at stake. Janet, Jean, Bobby, June, and Margaret ran them relentlessly, ensuring that every officer, veteran, or novice learned through experience, not argument. One officer, Lieutenant Commander Ellis, entered the pit confident in his years at sea. He had commanded convoys across the Atlantic for nearly 20 years and believed his instincts could never be outmatched. Janet set up the scenario: 50 merchant ships, 8 escort destroyers, 3 U-boats under her command. The briefing was short. Ellis took the lead of the escorts, positioning them as doctrine dictated. Aggressive pursuit, overlapping search zones, wide perimeter coverage, the same mistakes that had doomed countless convoys. The simulation began. As predicted, the U-boats moved into visual range, exposing themselves to lure escorts away. Ellis's destroyers followed the textbook response, leaving gaping holes in the convoy screen. Ouch. Janet's remaining U-boats slipped through, attacking with lethal precision. Red markers began to appear. Ships sank. Not a single U-boat was lost. Ellis's confidence shattered with each loss. By the end of the scenario, 12 merchant ships were destroyed, and the room was filled with stunned silence. Janet calmly, explained every move. Your escorts chased the lead U-boat, creating gaps. Each gap was exploited. This is not luck. This is mathematics. This is predictable. Ellis stared at the floor, then at Janet, then at the evidence that could not be denied. For the first time, he understood the devastating flaw in doctrine. It wasn't aggression that was heroic, which was control, precision, and staying with the convoy across the Atlantic. So the impact was already being felt. Convoy losses had begun to drop. Officers trained at Derby House returned to their posts and implemented the lessons they had learned. The new tactics, tight formations, preemptive blocking, coordinated zigzag patterns were saving ships. Every day, fewer red markers appeared in reality. Fewer sailors were lost. The Battle of the Atlantic was slowly tipping in favor of the Allies, and the credit belonged to the Wrens, who had used nothing more than chalk, models, and mathematical brilliance to transform the Navy. Janet remained unflinching. There was no pride in the work, only focus. Every new officer tested, every scenario repeated, every convoy saved reinforced the same principle. Mathematics could defeat doctrine. Logic could save lives, and tradition could not outweigh reason. Wren's work was no longer theoretical. It was operational. Real convoys were surviving because a small team of determined girls had forced change at the highest levels. By mid-1943, the Royal Navy was unrecognizable from the previous year. The chaos of past convoys had been replaced with order, coordination, and precision. U-boats that had once terrorized the Atlantic now met formidable resistance. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. German commanders reading after action reports, found convoys impenetrable. British officers returned home with confidence. And all of it traced back to a cold basement in Liverpool, a chalk grid on the floor, and the relentless calculations of Janet Oakl in this rehook. The story wasn't about loss, it was about adaptation, about seizing the lessons of tragedy and transforming them into a force capable of saving tens of thousands of lives. Janet's brilliance had gone from overlooked to essential. The Atlantic was safe, not through firepower, not through machines, but through intellect and persistence. By the latter half of 1943, the impact of Janet Oakl and the WWII unit was undeniable. The once ravaged Atlantic convoys were now sailing with unprecedented safety. The defensive escort tactics she had meticulously calculated, tight formations, preemptive blocking, and mathematically timed responses had reduced merchant ship losses dramatically. Every officer who had endured the freezing basement simulations at Derby House returned to duty carrying the same lesson. The old doctrine of aggressive pursuit was lethal, and logic must prevail over tradition. The results were measurable and immediate. Convoy losses dropped sharply. U-boats that had once ruled the Atlantic were now repelled with precise coordination. And the German wolf packs, accustomed to exploiting gaps in escort screens, were frustrated by an ironclad defensive approach. Grand Admiral Dönitz himself would later refer to May 1943 as Black May, the month when the German submarine fleet suffered its heaviest losses. 41 U-boats destroyed in just 31 days, hundreds of sailors killed. The significant reduction in German operational effectiveness saw stemming from tactics devised by a group of teenage girls in a cold basement in Liverpool. The WWII team's innovations, raspberry, beta search, pineapple, and step aside became standard practice. Officers who had initially resisted change now taught these methods to their subordinates. The Royal Navy, once crippled by adherence to centuries-old doctrine, had transformed into a fleet capable of withstanding and defeating the U-boat threat. Every convoy that reached port safely was a testament to the Wren's tireless dedication. Every ship spared was a life saved from the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Yet the work remained invisible to the public. Janet and her colleagues were bound by the Official Secrets Act. Recognition was rare, and their contribution to the war was largely unacknowledged outside naval circles. Still, Janet found fulfillment not in fame, but in the knowledge that her calculations had saved thousands of lives, that the deaths of men like her brother Thomas had not been in vain, and that the Atlantic convoys now had a fighting chance. By the end of the war, Janet Oakl had trained over 5,000 Allied officers, including Americans, Canadians, Norwegians, and Poles. The tactical lessons learned at Derby House spread to navies across the world. The principles she developed continued to influence naval doctrine, ensuring that future generations of sailors were safer and better prepared. While the Navy adopted her tactics, her name remained largely unknown. Single photograph in the National Maritime Museum shows her standing at the plotting table with chalk in hand, the intensity in her eyes capturing the determination that had reshaped naval warfare. The tangible results spoke louder than any accolades. Between 1943 and 1945, WWII's innovations were credited with saving an estimated 4,000 merchant ships and 48,000 Allied sailors. Every ship that remained afloat, every convoy that reached Britain with its cargo intact, was a triumph of intellect over tradition, calculation over assumption. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had once seemed insurmountable, had been won not through brute force or technology alone, but through disciplined strategy and rigorous analysis. Janet's story was a reminder that courage, insight, and perseverance could rewrite the rules, even in the most entrenched institutions. The Navy had learned to value logic over legacy, precision over pride, and life over doctrine. The Atlantic was no longer a battlefield dictated by chance, it was a theater of calculated defense. A victory forged by chalk lines, stopwatches, and the brilliance of a 19-year-old girl who refused to let tradition claim more lives. With the Atlantic secured and German U-boats suffering devastating losses, the aftermath of WWII's work began to ripple through the Royal Navy. Officers who had once resisted change now fully embraced the new doctrine. The convoys sailed with tight, unbreakable screens. The once terrifying wolf packs were forced to withdraw or risk annihilation. The Battle of the Atlantic, a struggle that had threatened Britain's very survival, had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. And it had been achieved not through massive fleets or technological marvels, but through the meticulous planning of teenage mathematicians. The fallout wasn't only strategic, it was personal. Janet Oakl, who had spent months in near isolation, running simulations, correcting officers' mistakes, and proving doctrine wrong, carried the weight of lives saved and lost. The death of her brother Thomas, a destroyer officer, lost following. The very tactics she had proven fatal remained a private grief that drove her relentless dedication. Every officer she trained, every convoy she saved, was a small measure of justice. A silent tribute to the brother whose death had been ignored. By those in command, the impact extended beyond Britain. Allied navies worldwide began adopting WWII's innovations. The U.S. Navy implemented Raspberry and Beta Search within months, while the Canadian Navy incorporated Pineapple and Step Aside. Officers trained at Derby House returned home with the knowledge and authority to implement these doctrines in their respective fleets, ensuring that Atlantic convoys and those in other theaters were far safer than before. The tactical lessons developed by a handful of determined women were saving thousands of lives daily, influencing global naval operations and shaping the course of the war. Yet, despite the success, public recognition was minimal. The official Secrets Act ensured that Janet and her colleagues remained in the shadows. Newspapers and official histories focused on Enigma, radar, and the heroism of fleet officers, but rarely mentioned the girls who had rewritten naval strategy with nothing more than chalk, floorboards, and mathematics. The Navy absorbed the tactics, and convoys survived, but the Wrens themselves were almost entirely forgotten in the public record by the war's end. Janet Oakl had spent 3 years at Derby House, personally training over 5,000 Allied officers. The innovations she helped develop became standard practice in navies across the world, yet her name remained absent from the annals of history. The photograph of her in the pit chalk in hand, focused and determined, remains one of the few public reminders of her work. She continued to live modestly, teaching mathematics, never seeking fame, content in the knowledge that she had saved countless lives. The tactical revolution she had pioneered had lasting consequences. German U-boat operations in the North Atlantic were crippled, convoy losses dropped dramatically, and Allied supply lines remained secure. The threat of starvation to Britain was eliminated. The lessons learned at Derby House informed naval strategy, for decades influencing convoy protection doctrines, anti-submarine warfare training, and naval tactical planning worldwide. One young girl's insight had reshaped the war. Janet's legacy was subtle but monumental. Recognition came decades later, when partially declassified WWII records revealed the extraordinary contribution of the Wrens. Scholars, historians, and naval officers finally acknowledged that the Battle of the Atlantic had been won not only by fleets and technology, but by intelligence, innovation, and courage. Janet Oakl had rewritten history silently, proving that even in war, intellect and perseverance could save thousands, if not tens of thousands, of lives. The Atlantic had been won. The convoys survived. Because a teenage girl had dared to challenge doctrine, mathematically prove a better way, and relentlessly ensure that no one would ignore her warning again. Janet Patricia Oakl walked away from Derby House in May 1945. The war finally over, the Atlantic convoy safe, and her mission complete. 3 years of relentless simulations. Chalk-stained fingers and unyielding mathematics had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. She had trained thousands of officers, changed doctrine, and saved tens of thousands of lives, but the world would never know her name. She returned to civilian life quietly, becoming a mathematics teacher, raising a family, and living modestly. Recognition was scarce. The official Secrets Act kept her contributions hidden, while history books celebrated generals, admirals, and technological breakthroughs. Janet's brilliance remained a secret. Yet, she felt no bitterness. The lives she had saved, the convoys that had reached port intact, and the sailors who returned home safely were all the acknowledgement she ever needed. Her work endured. Hidden in the doctrines taught to navies worldwide. Asbury, beta search, pineapple, step aside. These innovations continued to protect sailors long after she left the pit. The photograph of her at just 19, chalk in hand, eyes focused, standing among her fellow Wrens remains a silent testament to courage, intellect, and resilience. Janet's story reminds us that history is not only shaped by battlefield heroics, but by insight, innovation, and the courage to challenge tradition. One teenage girl armed with mathematics and determination had changed the course of a war, forced an empire to rethink its doctrine, had saved thousands of lives in the process. Janet Oakl passed away on November 5, 2009, at the age of 86. Her obituary was brief. Few knew the true magnitude of her achievements. Yet, the Atlantic remained secure. The convoys survived, and the lessons she taught lived on in the strategies, doctrines, and lives she saved. In the quiet corners of history, Janet Oakl's chalk lines on a basement floor continue to ripple. Through time, proving that courage and brilliance can alter the course of history one calculated move at a time.